In a world where appearance often determines worth, where scars are seen as weakness rather than stories of survival, one woman's journey from ridicule to respect would challenge everything people believed about true strength. Her face told a story that others were too afraid to read, her silence hiding secrets that could change how an entire nation viewed heroism. What they didn't know was that beneath those scars lay the heart of a legend, a warrior whose call sign struck fear into enemies and hope into allies across 3 continents. This is the story of how mockery turned to reverence, how judgment became admiration, and how the most unlikely hero proved that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the courage to show the world who you really are. Elena Rodriguez sat in the corner of the coffee shop, her long brown hair carefully arranged to cover the left side of her face. The scars that ran from her temple to her jaw were hidden beneath the cascade of hair, but she could still feel the weight of curious stares from other customers. At 28, she had perfected the art of becoming invisible, of moving through the world without drawing attention to the marks that told a story she wasn't ready to share. The morning rush brought its usual crowd of office workers and students, all rushing to start their day with caffeine and purpose. Elena watched them from behind her laptop screen, observing the easy way they moved through life, unmarked by the kind of experiences that leave permanent reminders etched into skin and soul. She envied their casual confidence, the way they could look people directly in the eye without seeing pity or disgust reflected back. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" A young woman with bright red hair and kind eyes gestured to the chair across from Elena's table. The coffee shop had filled up during the morning rush, and available seating had become precious. Elena nodded toward the empty chair, grateful that her hair provided a natural barrier between herself and unwanted conversation. But the redhead, who introduced herself as Sophie, seemed determined to be friendly despite Elena's obvious attempts at isolation. "I love your laptop case," Sophie said, settling into her chair with a warm smile. "That quote about courage is beautiful. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Mark Twain, right?" Elena's fingers instinctively moved to adjust her hair, ensuring maximum coverage. "Actually, it's often attributed to him, but the real author is unknown," she replied quietly, surprised by her own response. She usually avoided conversations with strangers, but something about Sophie's genuine warmth made her guard drop slightly. Sophie's eyes lit up with interest. "A fellow quote enthusiast. I collect them, actually. There's something about the right words at the right moment that can change everything, don't you think?" Before Elena could respond, a commotion near the coffee counter drew their attention. A group of college students had knocked over a display of mugs, creating a loud crash that made several customers jump. In the chaos that followed, Elena's carefully arranged hair shifted, revealing a glimpse of the scarred tissue that she worked so hard to conceal. She saw Sophie's eyes register the scars, watched for the familiar pattern of shock, pity, or worse, disgust that usually followed such revelations. But, instead, Sophie simply maintained eye contact and continued their conversation as if nothing had changed. "You know," Sophie said thoughtfully, "I think the most powerful quotes are the ones that come from people who've actually lived through something difficult. There's a weight to words that come from real experience." Elena felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. When was the last time someone had looked at her without making her feel like a curiosity or an object of pity? Sophie's reaction was so unexpected, so refreshingly normal, that it caught Elena completely off guard. "I should go," Elena said abruptly, closing her laptop and gathering her things. The moment of connection had stirred something in her that she wasn't prepared to face, a longing for normalcy that she had convinced herself was impossible. But Sophie wasn't deterred. "I'm here every Tuesday morning," she said simply. "Same time, usually that table by the window. Good lighting for reading." She held up a worn paperback novel. "Just in case you ever want to share more quote wisdom." As Elena walked toward the door, she caught her reflection in the coffee shop's large windows. For just a moment, she tried to see herself through Sophie's eyes, to imagine what it might be like to exist in the world without the constant weight of hiding. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. The walk back to her small apartment took Elena through the downtown district, past the military recruitment center that she had avoided for months. Today, however, she found herself stopping in front of the building, reading the posters in the windows that promised purpose, honor, and the chance to serve something greater than oneself. She thought about the conversation with Sophie, about quotes that carried the weight of real experience. Her own experience felt too heavy to share, too complicated to explain to someone who lived in the normal world of coffee dates and casual conversations. But, standing there in front of the recruitment center, Elena felt the first stirring of an idea that would eventually change everything. Inside her apartment, Elena sat at her kitchen table and opened a drawer that she rarely touched. Inside was a manila folder containing newspaper clippings, military commendations, and photographs that told a story she had never spoken aloud. The headlines spoke of heroism and sacrifice, of a rescue mission that had saved dozens of lives but cost Elena everything she thought to find her. The central photograph showed a group of soldiers standing in front of a helicopter, their faces dirty but triumphant after a successful mission. Elena's younger self stood third from the left, her face unmarked, her smile confident and bright. The woman in that photograph had believed that courage was something you displayed on battlefields, that heroism was measured in dramatic moments of action and decision. The Elena of today understood that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happened in coffee shops and grocery stores, in the daily decision to keep moving forward when the world seemed determined to make you disappear. But understanding that truth and living it were two very different things. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Dr. Martinez, the therapist she had seen sporadically over the past 2 years. Their sessions had helped her manage the nightmares and the anxiety, but they had never addressed the deeper question of how to rebuild a life that felt worth living. "Dr. Martinez," Elena said when the call connected, "I think I'm ready to talk about what comes next." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, covering ground that Elena had been avoiding for months. Dr. Martinez listened without judgment as Elena described her encounter with Sophie, her moment of longing for connection, and her growing sense that hiding from the world was no longer sustainable. "What would it look like," Dr. Martinez asked, "to take one small step toward the life you want instead of the life you think you deserve?" The question stayed with Elena long after the call ended. That evening, she found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror, really looking at her reflection for the first time in months. The scars were still there, still prominent, still a permanent reminder of a night that had changed everything. But, for the first time, Elena tried to see them not as marks of damage, but as evidence of survival. She thought about Sophie's words regarding quotes that carried the weight of real experience. Elena's experience included things that most people would never face, moments of crisis that had revealed both the worst and the best of human nature. Perhaps those experiences, painful as they were, had value beyond the suffering they had caused. The next morning brought Elena back to the coffee shop, though she arrived an hour earlier than her usual time. She needed to test her resolve in smaller doses before attempting another encounter with Sophie's generous acceptance. The morning crowd was different at this hour, mostly quiet individuals nursing their first cups of coffee and reading newspapers or checking emails. Elena chose a table near the center of the room instead of her usual corner spot. She deliberately wore her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, making no attempt to hide the scars that marked the left side of her face. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like stepping onto a stage where she had forgotten all her lines. The reactions were mixed but not as dramatic as Elena had feared. Some people noticed and looked away quickly, others stared briefly before returning to their own business. A few customers seemed genuinely unbothered, treating Elena with the same casual politeness they extended to everyone else. When Sophie arrived at her usual time and spotted Elena at the new table, her face broke into a genuine smile of recognition and pleasure. She approached without hesitation, carrying her coffee and paperback novel. "Mind if I join you?" Sophie asked, settling into the seat across from Elena before waiting for an answer. "I brought a different book today. This one has some amazing quotes about resilience. I thought you might appreciate them." As Sophie opened her book and began sharing passages that had resonated with her, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on literature, philosophy, and the small observations that make daily life interesting. For nearly an hour, Elena existed in the world as simply herself, neither hiding nor explaining, just being present in a moment of genuine human connection. It was a small step, barely visible to outside observers, but, for Elena it represented the beginning of a journey back to the world she had left behind. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, filled with challenges that would test every ounce of courage she had developed during her years of hiding. But, sitting in that coffee shop, listening to Sophie read quotes about resilience and strength, Elena began to believe that perhaps there was a place in the world for someone like her after all. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elena's phone buzzing with a text message. The sender was Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, her former commanding officer and one of the few people who knew the complete truth about the mission that had changed everything. His message was brief but loaded with significance. "Elena, we need to talk. There's something happening that requires your specific expertise. Can we meet?" As Elena stared at the message, she felt the weight of her past colliding with the fragile new beginning she was trying to build. Sophie noticed the change in her expression immediately. "Everything okay?" Sophie asked with genuine concern. Elena looked up from her phone, meeting Sophie's eyes directly for the first time since they had met. "I think," she said slowly, "my quiet life is about to get very complicated." Elena sat in the parking lot of the downtown military complex for 20 minutes before finding the courage to walk through the front doors. The building held too many memories, too many associations with the person she used to be. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had insisted on meeting here rather than somewhere neutral, and Elena suspected she knew why. He wanted her to remember who she had been before everything changed. The security checkpoint was staffed by young soldiers who processed her visitor credentials with professional efficiency. None of them recognized her, which was both a relief and a strange sort of disappointment. 2 years ago, Elena Rodriguez had been a name that carried weight in these halls, associated with successful missions and innovative tactical approaches that had saved countless lives. Morrison's office was on the 3rd floor, down a hallway lined with photographs commemorating various military achievements and fallen heroes. Elena walked slowly past these images, noting how many of the faces belonged to people she had known, worked with, or trained alongside. The military had been her world for 8 years, providing structure, purpose, and a clear sense of right and wrong that civilian life seemed to lack. Elena, Morrison stood as she entered his office, his expression mixing professional formality with genuine warmth. At 52, he remained an imposing figure, though Elena noticed new lines around his eyes and a few more gray hairs than she remembered. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." The office was exactly as Elena remembered it, filled with commendations, maps, and the controlled chaos of someone who managed multiple complex operations simultaneously. Morrison gestured toward a chair across from his desk, but Elena found herself drawn to the wall of photographs that documented his 30-year career. "You're in several of these," Morrison said, following her gaze. "Operation Thunder Ridge, the Kandahar Rescue, the embassy extraction in South America. Good memories, all of them." Elena stopped in front of a photograph that showed her standing next to Morrison and 3 other soldiers after a particularly difficult mission in Afghanistan. Her younger self looked confident and capable, unmarked by the experiences that would later define her. The woman in that photograph had believed that courage was straightforward, that heroism was measured in clear victories against obvious enemies. "You said there was something happening that required my specific expertise," Elena said, turning away from the photographs. "What kind of something?" Morrison moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder marked with various security classifications. 3 weeks ago, we received intelligence about a kidnapping situation in South America. American civilians, including several aid workers and a journalist, being held by a group that's proven resistant to conventional rescue approaches. He spread several photographs across his desk, showing aerial views of a remote compound surrounded by dense jungle terrain. Elena recognized the tactical challenges immediately. The location was isolated, heavily defended, and situated in terrain that would make traditional military approaches extremely dangerous. "The kidnappers have proven to be well-trained and highly organized," Morrison continued. "They've anticipated most of our standard tactical responses and have positioned themselves in a location that neutralizes many of our technological advantages. We need someone who can think outside conventional parameters." Elena studied the photographs with the analytical mind that had made her such an effective tactical planner. The compound's location was chosen specifically to create maximum difficulty for rescue operations. Dense jungle provided cover for the defenders while limiting visibility and movement for any attacking force. The single-access road was easily defended, and aerial approaches would be vulnerable to ground fire. "What makes you think this requires my specific expertise?" Elena asked, though she was beginning to understand where the conversation was heading. Morrison opened another folder and removed a series of communication intercepts. "Because," he said quietly, "the kidnappers have specifically requested negotiations with someone they're calling Ghost Phoenix. They claim they have information about Operation Broken Arrow that they'll only share with her." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Operation Broken Arrow was classified at the highest levels, known only to a handful of people who had been directly involved. The fact that these kidnappers not only knew about it but knew Elena's call sign from that mission suggested connections and intelligence capabilities that went far beyond typical criminal organizations. "Who else knows about this?" Elena asked, her mind already racing through the implications. "7 people, including us," Morrison replied. "The Joint Chiefs are treating this as a potential national security issue. Whatever these people know about Broken Arrow, we can't let it become public knowledge." Elena moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard where young soldiers were conducting training exercises. She remembered being their age, believing that right and wrong were clearly defined, that America's enemies were obvious, and her own role in protecting innocent people was unquestionably good. Operation Broken Arrow had challenged all of those assumptions. "I'm not active duty anymore," Elena said without turning around. "I'm not even in the reserves. I'm a civilian now." "Technically, yes," Morrison acknowledged. "But we both know that some experiences create bonds that transcend official status. Those hostages need someone with your specific skills and knowledge. More importantly, if these kidnappers really do know something about Broken Arrow, we need to control that information." Elena turned back to face Morrison, seeing in his expression the same mixture of respect and concern that had characterized their working relationship for years. He had been her commanding officer during some of the most dangerous and successful missions of her military career, and he understood better than most what Operation Broken Arrow had cost her. "The scars," Elena said simply. "They'll be a problem. The hostages won't trust someone who looks like me. Neither will most of the rescue team." Morrison's expression hardened. "Anyone who has a problem with your appearance can find themselves reassigned to desk duty. Your tactical record speaks for itself. Operation Thunder Ridge saved 43 civilians. The Kandahar rescue brought home 12 soldiers who would have died in captivity. The embassy extraction prevented an international incident that could have destabilized an entire region. And Operation Broken Arrow nearly killed me and did kill 6 good soldiers," Elena replied. "Maybe these kidnappers know something about that mission that I don't. Maybe they know why it went wrong." The silence that followed was heavy with shared memories of decisions made under impossible circumstances, of consequences that continued to ripple outward long after the immediate crisis had ended. Morrison had been the one to visit Elena in the military hospital, had been present when the doctors explained the extent of her injuries and the long rehabilitation process ahead. "I need time to think about this," Elena said finally. "This isn't just about tactics or national security. If I do this, if I become Ghost Phoenix again, there's no going back to the quiet life I've been trying to build." Morrison nodded, understanding the weight of what he was asking. "Take the time you need. But, Elena, whatever you decide, know that those hostages are running out of time. Intelligence suggests the kidnappers are planning to move them within the next 10 days. After that, finding them again becomes exponentially more difficult." Elena gathered the photographs and files that Morrison offered her, knowing that taking them represented a step toward a decision she wasn't ready to make. As she prepared to leave, Morrison called her name. "Elena," he said, "for what it's worth, I think the woman who walked into this office today is stronger than the soldier who left it 2 years ago. The scars don't make you weaker. They're proof that you survived something that would have broken most people." The drive home gave Elena time to process the conversation and its implications. She thought about the hostages, innocent people whose lives now hung in the balance of her decision. She thought about Operation Broken Arrow and the questions that had haunted her since that night in the Colombian jungle. Most of all, she thought about the woman she had been trying to become versus the woman she had been trained to be. Back in her apartment, Elena spread the mission files across her kitchen table and began the analytical process that had made her one of the military's most effective tactical planners. The kidnapping situation was complex, requiring exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that had made her valuable to Morrison's operations. But, as she studied the details, Elena found herself thinking about Sophie and their conversation about quotes that carried the weight of real experience. The woman she was becoming valued connection, authenticity, and the courage to be vulnerable. The soldier she had been valued mission success, tactical efficiency, and the willingness to sacrifice personal needs for larger objectives. Could those two versions of herself coexist? Could she accept this mission without losing the progress she had made toward building a life worth living? Elena didn't know, but she knew that either choice would require more courage than she had ever needed on any battlefield. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sophie. "Hope your complicated situation is manageable. Remember what Hemingway said about courage being grace under pressure. Coffee tomorrow?" Elena stared at the message for several minutes before typing her response. "Rain check? Something from my past has come up that needs attention. But, yes, definitely coffee soon." It wasn't the complete truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Elena was beginning to understand that her past and her future might be more connected than she had realized. The question was whether she had the strength to bridge the gap between who she had been and who she was becoming. That night, Elena dreamed of helicopters and gunfire, of faces depending on her decisions and voices calling her by a name she had tried to forget. But, this time, instead of waking in terror, she woke with a sense of clarity that had been missing from her life for months. She knew what she had to do. The question was whether she was ready to do it. Elena spent the morning researching everything she could find about the kidnapping situation, using resources and contacts that she hadn't accessed since leaving the military. The picture that emerged was troubling. The kidnappers were well-funded, professionally trained, and had access to intelligence that suggested connections to larger criminal or terrorist networks. More concerning was their specific request for Ghost Phoenix. Elena's call sign from her special operations days wasn't widely known, even within military circles. The fact that these kidnappers knew it suggested either an intelligence leak or connections to people who had been present during her most classified missions. By noon, Elena had made her decision. She called Morrison's direct line. "Sir," she said when he answered, "this is Ghost Phoenix." "I'm in." The military transport plane touched down at the airbase in Colombia just after dawn, and Elena felt the familiar mixture of anxiety and anticipation that preceded every high-stakes mission. The difference this time was that she wasn't just Elena Rodriguez, tactical specialist, but also the woman who had spent 2 years learning to live with scars that told stories she had never wanted to share. Captain Marcus Webb met her at the landing strip, his expression carefully neutral as he took in her civilian clothing and the visible scarring on the left side of her face. Elena recognized the look immediately, professional courtesy masking personal discomfort and uncertainty about working with someone whose appearance challenged conventional expectations. "Ma'am," Webb said, offering a crisp salute. "Captain Webb, your liaison for this operation. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison sends his regards and asked me to brief you on recent developments." Elena returned the salute automatically, muscle memory taking over despite her civilian status. "Thank you, Captain. What's the current situation with the hostages?" As they walked toward a waiting jeep, Webb outlined the latest intelligence. The kidnappers had made contact again, reiterating their demand to negotiate only with Ghost Phoenix and providing proof of life for all 7 hostages. More troubling, they had demonstrated knowledge of specific details about Elena's past missions that weren't included in any official reports. "They know things," Webb said as they drove toward the temporary command center, "that only someone who was actually present during Operation Broken Arrow would know. Details about timing, personnel, decisions made in the field that never appeared in any documentation." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the early morning air. Operation Broken Arrow had been a nightmare of miscommunication, intelligence failures, and split-second decisions made under impossible circumstances. The official reports had been sanitized to protect operational security and the reputations of everyone involved. But someone with access to the real story could cause significant damage to people Elena cared about. The command center was a collection of prefabricated buildings and communication trailers arranged around a central coordination facility. Elena was struck by how familiar it all felt: the controlled chaos of multiple operations running simultaneously, the constant hum of radio traffic, the mixture of tension and professionalism that characterized military operations in hostile territory. General Sarah Matthews was waiting in the main briefing room, surrounded by tactical displays and satellite imagery that showed the target location in real-time detail. Elena had worked with Matthews before, during the embassy extraction that had earned them both commendations and the respect of their peers. "Elena," Matthews said, standing to greet her with a firm handshake and direct eye contact that acknowledged the scars without making them the focus of attention. "Thank you for coming. We have a situation that requires exactly your kind of thinking." The briefing that followed confirmed Elena's worst fears about the complexity of the rescue operation. The kidnappers had chosen their location brilliantly, situating their compound in terrain that neutralized most conventional military advantages while maximizing their own defensive capabilities. Satellite imagery showed multiple defensive positions, overlapping fields of fire, and what appeared to be sophisticated early warning systems. Traditional assault approaches have a high probability of resulting in hostage casualties, Matthews explained, using a laser pointer to highlight specific tactical challenges. The compound's design suggests these people have military training and understand how we typically conduct rescue operations. Elena studied the imagery with the analytical mind that had made her effective at solving tactical puzzles that stymied other planners. The compound's weaknesses weren't immediately obvious, but they existed. Every defensive position had vulnerabilities, every plan had gaps that could be exploited by someone willing to think creatively. "What about aerial insertion?" Elena asked, noting the dense canopy that surrounded the target area. "Possible, but risky," Captain Webb replied. "They have shoulder-fired missiles and the terrain makes precision insertion extremely difficult. We'd be dropping people into unknown landing zones with limited extraction options." Elena continued asking questions, probing for information about everything from local weather patterns to the psychological profiles of the kidnapping leaders. Her reputation for thorough preparation had been earned through years of missions where overlooked details had meant the difference between success and disaster. "I need to see the actual site," Elena said after absorbing all the available intelligence. "Satellite imagery is useful, but I need to understand the terrain personally." "Can we arrange reconnaissance?" Matthews and Webb exchanged glances that suggested Elena's request was both expected and problematic. "We can get you close enough for visual confirmation," Matthews said carefully, "but actual site inspection would require exposing you to significant risk." "General," Elena said, using the tone that had characterized their past successful collaborations, "this mission succeeds or fails based on details that can't be captured in satellite photographs. If I'm going to develop a plan that brings those hostages home alive, I need to see what we're really dealing with." The helicopter flight to the reconnaissance position took Elena over terrain that reminded her why she had fallen in love with military aviation in the first place. Dense jungle stretched to the horizon, broken by rivers and mountain ridges that created a landscape both beautiful and forbidding. From the air, the kidnappers' compound appeared as a small clearing surrounded by thousands of square miles of green wilderness. Through high-powered optics, Elena could see the defensive positions that made conventional assault so dangerous. But she could also see the patterns of movement, the routines and habits that suggested human vulnerabilities beneath the tactical preparations. Most importantly, she could see the building where intelligence suggested the hostages were being held. "How current is our intelligence on hostage location?" Elena asked the pilot through her headset. "Thermal imaging from this morning confirms 7 heat signatures in the central building," he replied. "But they've been moved at least twice in the past week, so we can't be certain they'll remain there." As the helicopter circled at maximum safe distance, Elena felt the familiar process of tactical visualization taking over. Her mind automatically catalogued sightlines, approach routes, timing requirements, and the hundreds of variables that would determine the difference between a successful rescue and a tragedy. But, this time, the process was complicated by her awareness of how much was at stake personally. The return flight gave Elena time to process what she had observed and begin formulating the unconventional approach that the situation demanded. By the time they landed at the command center, she had the foundation of a plan that would require everything she had learned about tactics, timing, and the psychology of combat operations. "I think I have an approach," Elena announced as she rejoined Matthews and Webb in the briefing room. "But it's going to require some resources that aren't typically available for rescue operations, and it's going to depend on the kidnappers making assumptions about how we operate." Over the next several hours, Elena outlined a plan that drew on lessons learned from every successful mission of her military career while incorporating elements that would surprise opponents who expected conventional tactical responses. The plan was complex, requiring precise timing and the coordination of multiple teams, but it offered the best chance of rescuing the hostages without triggering the defensive responses that had made previous approaches too dangerous. "This could work," Matthews said after Elena finished her presentation. "But it's going to require you to take personal risks that go beyond normal operational parameters. Are you prepared for that?" Elena considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, she would have answered immediately, driven by a sense of duty and professional pride that made personal risk irrelevant. Today, she had to weigh her responsibility to the hostages against her commitment to the new life she was building and the people who had begun to matter to her in civilian life. "General," Elena said finally, "I've spent 2 years learning that courage isn't just about being willing to face danger. It's about being willing to face the consequences of your choices and live with the results. Those hostages didn't choose to be in this situation. I did choose to be here. That makes this my responsibility." The preparation phase that followed required Elena to work with teams of specialists she had never met, people who knew her reputation but were seeing her in person for the first time since her injuries. The reactions varied from professional acceptance to barely concealed discomfort, but Elena found that her confidence in the tactical plan helped her navigate the interpersonal challenges. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos approached Elena during a break in the planning session. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I wanted you to know that my brother was one of the soldiers you brought home during the Kandahar rescue. He talks about Ghost Phoenix like she was some kind of legend. It's an honor to work with you." The comment caught Elena off guard, reminding her that her military service had affected people beyond her own experience. She had spent so much time thinking about Operation Broken Arrow and its consequences that she had almost forgotten the successful missions, the lives saved, the difference her work had made. "Thank you, Sergeant," Elena replied. "Your brother earned his way home through his own courage. I just helped with the logistics." As the sun set over the Colombian mountains, Elena found herself standing outside the command center, reviewing final details of a mission that would begin before dawn. She thought about Sophie, probably sitting in their coffee shop reading her book of inspirational quotes. She thought about Dr. Martinez and their conversations about taking steps toward the life she wanted rather than the life she thought she deserved. Most of all, she thought about the hostages, people whose lives now depended on decisions she would make in the next few hours. The weight of that responsibility was familiar, but this time Elena carried it differently. She was no longer just a soldier following orders, but a woman who had chosen to use her skills in service of something larger than herself. Captain Webb approached with the final intelligence update. "Ma'am, we've got confirmation that the hostages are still in the central building. Weather forecast shows optimal conditions for the next 6 hours. All teams report ready status." Elena nodded, feeling the familiar shift in consciousness that preceded high-stakes operations. Tomorrow, she would once again be Ghost Phoenix, the tactical specialist whose reputation had been built on successful missions under impossible circumstances. But she would also be Elena Rodriguez, a woman who had learned that true courage sometimes meant allowing yourself to be seen, scars and all, by people who mattered. "Thank you, Captain," she said. "Let's bring them home." The operation began at 0300 hours under a moonless sky that provided perfect cover for the initial phases of Elena's unconventional plan. Unlike traditional rescue operations that relied on overwhelming force or stealth insertion, her approach was designed to exploit the kidnappers' expectations and turn their defensive preparations against them. Elena crouched in the dense jungle vegetation 200 meters from the compound's perimeter, watching through night vision equipment as her carefully coordinated deception unfolded. The first phase involved creating multiple false signals that would suggest a conventional assault from the most obvious approach routes, drawing the defenders' attention away from the actual rescue operation. "Ghost Phoenix, this is Overwatch," came the voice of Captain Webb through her radio headset. "Distraction elements are in position. Heat signatures show movement toward the southern defensive positions as expected." Elena smiled grimly. The kidnappers were reacting exactly as she had predicted, concentrating their forces to defend against attacks that weren't coming while leaving their flanks vulnerable to the real rescue teams. It was a classic example of how assumptions could become tactical weaknesses. Copy, Overwatch. Beginning approach to primary objective. The route Elena had chosen required her to move through terrain that the satellite imagery had suggested was impassable. But her aerial reconnaissance had revealed a dry creek bed that provided concealed access to within 50 meters of the building where the hostages were being held. The approach was dangerous, requiring her to move alone through territory that could hide booby traps or sentries, but it was the only way to get close enough to assess the situation inside the target building. Moving through jungle terrain at night was a skill Elena had developed during years of special operations training, but she quickly discovered that her injuries had affected her mobility in ways she hadn't anticipated. The left side of her face, still partially numb from nerve damage, made it difficult to judge distances accurately in low light conditions. More critically, the pain medication she occasionally took had dulled some of her reflexes. 40 meters from the target building, Elena froze as her night vision picked up movement near what appeared to be an empty sentry position. A guard was moving through the shadows, conducting a patrol pattern that hadn't been visible from aerial reconnaissance. The man was well trained, moving with the disciplined silence of someone with military experience. Elena waited for the guard to pass before continuing her approach, but the encounter confirmed her suspicions about the sophistication of their opponents. These weren't typical criminals or even standard terrorist operatives. They moved, communicated, and positioned themselves like people who understood professional military tactics. "Overwatch, I have visual on primary objective," Elena whispered into her radio as she reached the concealed position that would serve as her observation post. "Confirming 7 heat signatures in central building, but guard patterns suggest higher training level than initially assessed." Through her optics, Elena could see into the ground floor of the building where the hostages were being held. The 7 Americans were secured with restraints but appeared uninjured. More importantly for her tactical planning, she could see that they were being guarded by only 2 men, both positioned where they could observe the most obvious approach routes but couldn't see the rear of the building. "Ghost Phoenix, Rescue Team Alpha reports ready for insertion," came Sergeant Santos's voice through the radio. "Awaiting your signal." Elena studied the situation for several more minutes, looking for any detail that might affect the success of the rescue operation. The timing had to be perfect. Rescue Team Alpha would fast rope from helicopters onto the building's roof while Elena's distraction elements kept the defenders focused on false threats. But if any part of the coordination failed, the hostages would be caught in crossfire that could prove fatal. "All teams, this is Ghost Phoenix. Execute rescue operation in 30 seconds. Mark." Elena began her final approach to the building, moving through shadows that provided concealment while keeping her within range to provide covering fire if the rescue teams encountered unexpected resistance. The plan called for her to breach the rear entrance simultaneously with the roof insertion, creating a 2-pronged attack that would overwhelm the guards before they could harm the hostages. The sound of helicopters approaching from the north provided the audio cover Elena needed to reach the rear door of the building. Through the thin walls, she could hear voices speaking in accented English, confirming that some of the kidnappers were foreign nationals with training that exceeded anything local criminal groups typically possessed. "Roof team in position," Santos reported. "Breach on your mark." Elena counted down from 3, then kicked in the rear door just as the roof team crashed through skylights above. The coordination was perfect, creating exactly the kind of chaos that made defensive responses impossible. The 2 guards in the main room spun toward the noise from above, leaving their backs exposed to Elena's entry point. "Nobody move!" Elena shouted, her weapon trained on the nearest guard. "Hands visible, weapons down." 1 guard complied immediately, but the second reached for a radio that would alert the entire compound to the rescue operation. Elena's shot was precise, disabling the man without killing him but ensuring that no warning could be transmitted to other defenders. Hostages secured, Santos reported as her team descended from the roof and began cutting the restraints that bound the 7 Americans. No injuries, all subjects conscious and responsive. Elena maintained her position covering the entrance while the rescue team prepared the hostages for extraction. The entire operation had taken less than 90 seconds, but she knew that the most dangerous phase was still ahead. Moving 7 civilians through hostile territory to the extraction point would require all of her tactical skills. Ghost Phoenix, this is Overwatch. Compound defenders are moving toward your location. Estimate 2 minutes before they reach primary objective. The extraction plan Elena had developed required the rescued hostages to move through the same dry creek bed she had used for her approach, but 7 people moving together would be much more visible than a single operator. The alternative routes were either too exposed or too dangerous for civilians who lacked military training. Hostages, listen carefully, Elena said, addressing the freed Americans directly for the first time. I'm going to get you out of here, but you need to follow my instructions exactly. We're going to move quickly and quietly through difficult terrain. Stay close, watch where I step, and don't make any noise unless I tell you to. Dr. Jennifer Morrison, one of the aid workers, looked at Elena with a mixture of gratitude and concern. Are you military? She asked, noting Elena's tactical gear and professional demeanor despite her civilian status. Former military, Elena replied, beginning to move toward the rear exit. But I know what I'm doing. Trust me. The movement through the jungle was more difficult than Elena had anticipated. The hostages, weakened by days in captivity, struggled to maintain the pace necessary to stay ahead of pursuing guards. Dr. Morrison, a woman in her 50s, began showing signs of exhaustion after only a few minutes of movement through dense vegetation. I can't keep up, Morrison whispered during a brief rest stop. Leave me and get the others to safety. Elena looked at the woman who had spent years providing medical care to refugees and disaster victims, seeing in her face the same commitment to others that had driven Elena's own military service. Nobody gets left behind, Elena said firmly. That's not how this works. The pursuit was getting closer. Elena could hear voices and movement in the jungle behind them, evidence that the kidnappers had organized a search effort that would eventually overtake their small group. The extraction point was still 800 meters away, too far to reach before being caught by professionally trained trackers. Overwatch, this is Ghost Phoenix. Request immediate support at grid reference 847 to 392. We have civilians who can't maintain pace for standard extraction. Copy, Ghost Phoenix. Extraction birds are en route, but you need to hold your position for 12 minutes. 12 minutes was an eternity when being pursued through jungle terrain by hostile forces. Elena quickly surveyed their surroundings, looking for a defensive position that would allow her small group to survive until help arrived. A cluster of large rocks and fallen trees provided some concealment, but it wouldn't stop determined attackers for long. Everyone down behind the rocks, Elena ordered the hostages. Stay low and don't move unless I tell you to. Elena positioned herself where she could cover the most likely approach routes while maintaining communication with the extraction helicopters. The sound of pursuit was getting closer, and she could hear at least 3 different voices coordinating their search pattern. The first contact came when a guard appeared at the edge of their concealed position, his AK-47 rifle scanning for targets. Elena's shot was precise and quiet, dropping the man before he could alert his companions. But his disappearance would be noticed within minutes, bringing more searchers to their location. Dr. Morrison, Elena whispered to the aid worker, I need you to help keep the others calm. This is going to get intense, but the helicopters are coming. Morrison nodded, moving among the other hostages to provide the kind of reassurance that only came from years of working in crisis situations. Elena was struck by the woman's composure under circumstances that would paralyze most civilians. The second contact was more dangerous. 2 guards approached from different directions, forcing Elena to engage multiple targets while protecting 7 people who had no combat training. Her first shots disabled 1 attacker, but the second managed to return fire before Elena could adjust her position. The bullet struck the rock inches from Elena's head, sending stone fragments across her already scarred face and reminding her viscerally of the night that had nearly ended her military career. For a moment, she was back in Colombia 2 years ago, watching Operation Broken Arrow collapse around her and feeling the explosion that had nearly killed her. But this time was different. This time, Elena wasn't fighting for abstract objectives or following orders she didn't fully understand. She was protecting people who had chosen to put themselves at risk to help others, and she was doing it as a conscious choice rather than a professional obligation. Ghost Phoenix, extraction birds are 2 minutes out. Mark your position with smoke. Elena threw a smoke grenade that would guide the helicopters to their location while simultaneously concealing their exact positions from remaining pursuers. The sound of rotor blades was growing louder, promising rescue but also announcing to every hostile in the area exactly where the extracted group would be located. The final moments were the most dangerous. Elena had to maintain defensive fire while helping the hostages move to the extraction point, exposing herself to enemy fire while ensuring that 7 civilians reached safety. Dr. Morrison stumbled during the movement, and Elena found herself supporting the older woman while simultaneously engaging targets that threatened their escape route. "Go, we go, we go," shouted the helicopter crew chief as the extraction bird touched down in a small clearing. "We've got incoming hostiles from multiple directions." Elena was the last person to board the helicopter, providing covering fire as the aircraft lifted off and carried them away from the compound that had held 7 people captive for nearly 2 weeks. As they gained altitude and safety, she felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and elation that followed successful rescue operations. Dr. Morrison gripped Elena's hand as the helicopter flew toward safety. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know who you are, but thank you for not leaving us behind." Elena looked at the woman whose dedication to helping others had put her in harm's way, seeing in her face the same commitment that had originally drawn Elena to military service. "It's what we do," Elena replied. "We take care of each other." As the helicopter carried them toward the base where debriefing and medical evaluation awaited, Elena reflected on how different this mission had felt from Operation Broken Arrow. The tactical challenges had been similar, but her approach to leadership, risk management, and team coordination had been influenced by everything she had learned during her 2 years of recovery and reflection. The woman who had planned and executed this rescue operation was neither the confident soldier she had been before her injuries nor the broken veteran she had become afterward. She was something new, someone who combined tactical expertise with hard-won wisdom about what really mattered in life. The mission was successful, but Elena knew that the most difficult challenges were still ahead. The kidnappers had mentioned Operation Broken Arrow, suggesting they possessed information that could threaten national security or the reputations of people she cared about. Understanding what they knew and how they had obtained that information would require her to confront aspects of her past that she had tried to forget. But, for now, 7 Americans were safe, and Elena Rodriguez had proven to herself and others that her scars were evidence of survival rather than symbols of failure. It was a beginning rather than an ending, the first step in a journey that would ultimately lead her back to the life she had thought was lost forever. The interrogation room at the secure facility in Colombia was deliberately austere, containing only a metal table, 2 chairs, and recording equipment that would capture every word of the conversation Elena was about to have with the captured kidnapping leader. General Matthews had briefed her on what they knew about Carlos Mendoza, a former intelligence operative who had worked for multiple governments before disappearing into the criminal underworld. Elena sat across from Mendoza, studying a man whose weathered face and calculating eyes spoke of decades spent in dangerous situations. He had requested to speak with Ghost Phoenix specifically, and his calm demeanor suggested that capture had been part of his larger plan rather than an unexpected setback. "You are not what I expected," Mendoza said in heavily accented English, his gaze lingering on the scars that marked the left side of Elena's face. "The reports I received described a tactical genius, but they failed to mention that she had been marked by experience." Elena maintained professional composure despite her curiosity about what reports he might be referencing. "You wanted to speak with me. I'm here. What do you know about Operation Broken Arrow?" Mendoza smiled, an expression that held no warmth but considerable intelligence. "Ah, directly to the point. Very American. Very efficient. What I know about Broken Arrow is that it was not the failure your government has portrayed it to be. It was, in fact, a carefully orchestrated deception designed to protect something much more valuable than the lives of 6 soldiers. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Operation Broken Arrow had been the defining trauma of her military career, the mission that had killed 6 good people and left her permanently scarred. The suggestion that it had been anything other than a tragic intelligence failure challenged everything she believed about her own experience. "That's impossible," Elena said, working to keep her voice steady. "I was the tactical planner for that operation. I know exactly what went wrong and why people died." "Do you?" Mendoza leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Tell me, Ghost Phoenix, how did you select the insertion point for that mission? Who provided the intelligence about enemy positions? Most importantly, who suggested the timing that put your team in position during the exact window when enemy reinforcements arrived?" Elena felt a cold realization beginning to form as she recalled details of the mission planning that she had tried to forget. The intelligence had come through channels she hadn't questioned, from sources that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had vouched for personally. The timing had been suggested by a senior intelligence officer who had insisted that a narrow operational window required immediate action. "Even if what you're suggesting were true," Elena said carefully, "why would you know details that aren't in any official report? How could a criminal like you have access to classified mission planning?" Mendoza reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small photograph, placing it on the table where Elena could see it clearly. The image showed her younger self standing next to Morrison and several other officers, but in the background was a man Elena recognized as CIA operative David Sterling, someone who had been present during the Broken Arrow planning but hadn't appeared in any of the official documentation. "Because," Mendoza said quietly, "I was not always a criminal. 20 years ago, I worked with David Sterling on operations that required plausible deniability and careful management of information flow. Sterling contacted me 6 months ago with a proposition involving information about certain military operations that had been misrepresented in official records." Elena stared at the photograph, remembering Sterling as an intelligence officer who had provided crucial mission planning support during her special operations career. He had been present during the planning of Operation Broken Arrow, offering insights about enemy capabilities and suggesting tactical approaches that Elena had incorporated into her final plan. "What proposition?" Elena asked, though she was beginning to understand the implications of Mendoza's revelations. Sterling believed that certain people were becoming inconveniently curious about operations that were supposed to remain classified permanently. He suggested that a dramatic demonstration might discourage further investigation while simultaneously removing from active service a tactical planner whose skills had become too valuable to potential opponents. The room seemed to spin around Elena as the full implications of Mendoza's words became clear. Operation Broken Arrow hadn't been a failure of intelligence or planning. It had been a deliberate sacrifice, designed to eliminate her effectiveness while creating a plausible cover story for intelligence operations that needed to remain hidden. "The 6 soldiers who died," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper, "they were killed to protect Sterling's operations?" Mendoza nodded gravely. "Sterling provided intelligence that he knew was compromised, timing that he knew would put your team in maximum danger, and extraction support that he knew would arrive too late. The explosion that scarred you was caused by ordnance that Sterling's people had positioned specifically to disable rather than kill you. A dead Ghost Phoenix might have triggered investigations that Sterling couldn't afford." Elena felt 20 months of self-doubt and guilt crystallizing into a rage so pure it was almost blinding. She had blamed herself for the deaths of 6 soldiers, had carried the weight of that failure through months of painful recovery and years of trying to rebuild her sense of worth. Now she discovered that their deaths had been deliberate, the result of betrayal by someone she had trusted. "Where is Sterling now?" Elena asked, her voice carrying an edge that made Mendoza lean back slightly. "That," Mendoza said, "is information I am prepared to trade for certain considerations regarding my own situation. Sterling has continued his operations, using the cover provided by Broken Arrow's failure to eliminate oversight of his activities. But he has become concerned that someone with your tactical abilities might eventually piece together what really happened." General Matthews, who had been observing the interrogation through a one-way window, entered the room at that moment. Her expression was grim, suggesting that she had heard enough to understand the gravity of Mendoza's revelations. "Elena," Matthews said quietly, "I think we need to discuss this situation privately." The conversation that followed in Matthews' temporary office was one of the most difficult of Elena's military career. Matthews had known about irregularities in the Broken Arrow operation but hadn't possessed enough evidence to challenge Sterling's version of events. Elena's reputation and tactical skills had made her a potential threat to Sterling's continued operations, while her injuries and resulting retirement had eliminated that threat. "We suspected something," Matthews admitted, "but Sterling's connections and the classified nature of his work made investigation extremely difficult. Your return to active operations, even temporarily, has apparently prompted him to take more direct action." Elena studied satellite photographs and intelligence reports that painted a picture of Sterling's current operations in South America. He had been using his position to coordinate arms sales and intelligence sharing with criminal organizations, activities that generated enormous profits while supposedly advancing American interests in the region. "The kidnapping," Elena said, "pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place, was designed to draw me back into operations where Sterling could eliminate me permanently." Matthews nodded. "Mendoza's organization was hired to create a situation that would require your specific tactical expertise. The plan was for you to die during the rescue operation, eliminating the one person who might eventually remember enough details to expose Sterling's role in Broken Arrow." The rage Elena felt was unlike anything she had experienced, even during the worst moments of combat operations. Sterling's betrayal had cost the lives of 6 good soldiers and had stolen 2 years of her life while she struggled with undeserved guilt and shame. But underneath the anger was a determination to ensure that no other soldiers would die to protect Sterling's criminal activities. "General," Elena said, "I want to finish this. Sterling needs to face justice for what he's done, and I need to know that no one else will be sacrificed to cover up his crimes." The operation to apprehend Sterling required all of Elena's tactical expertise combined with resources that Matthews could barely authorize through official channels. Sterling had established himself in a fortified compound outside Bogota, surrounded by mercenaries and protected by diplomatic immunity that made conventional law enforcement approaches impossible. Elena's plan was characteristically unconventional, relying on Sterling's assumptions about her capabilities and his expectation that any approach would follow standard military procedures. Instead of a direct assault, she proposed a psychological operation designed to force Sterling into a position where he would expose himself while attempting to eliminate the threat she represented. The approach required Elena to allow herself to be captured by Sterling's mercenaries, trusting that her reputation and his desire for a personal confrontation would keep her alive long enough to spring the trap she was setting. It was dangerous to the point of being reckless, but Elena's analysis suggested it was the only way to get close enough to Sterling to gather the evidence needed for prosecution. "This isn't just about justice," Elena explained to Matthews during their final planning session. "This is about proving that 6 soldiers didn't die because I failed them. Their families deserve to know the truth about what happened." The capture went exactly as Elena had planned. Sterling's mercenaries took her to the compound where Sterling waited with the arrogance of someone who believed he had finally eliminated a long-standing threat. The conversation that followed was recorded by surveillance equipment that Elena had concealed before allowing herself to be taken. "Ghost Phoenix," Sterling said as Elena was brought before him, her hands bound but her expression defiant. "You always were too smart for your own good. If you had simply accepted that Broken Arrow was your failure and disappeared into civilian life, none of this would have been necessary." Elena looked at the man who had betrayed her trust and caused the deaths of 6 soldiers, seeing in his face the calculation and moral emptiness that had made such betrayal possible. "You're right," she said calmly. "I was too smart to believe that story forever. The question is whether you're smart enough to understand what's about to happen to you." Sterling's expression shifted as he began to understand that Elena's capture might not be the victory he had anticipated. Before he could react, the compound was surrounded by military forces that had been positioned based on intelligence Elena had provided during her capture. The evidence gathered during Sterling's confession, combined with Mendoza's testimony and documentation recovered from the compound, was sufficient to ensure prosecution for conspiracy, murder, and treason. Elena's tactical reputation, rather than being damaged by her association with Operation Broken Arrow, was enhanced by her role in exposing the truth about Sterling's crimes. 6 months later, Elena sat in the same coffee shop where she had met Sophie, but this time she chose a table in the center of the room with no attempt to hide the scars that had once made her ashamed. The conversation with Sophie flowed naturally, covering topics from literature to current events to the small observations that make daily life interesting. "You seem different," Sophie observed during a pause in their discussion of a book they had both recently read. "More settled, if that makes sense. Like you've made peace with something that was troubling you." Elena considered the observation, thinking about the journey that had brought her from hiding in corner tables to sitting openly in the center of crowded rooms. The scars were still there, still visible, still a permanent reminder of a night that had changed everything. But they no longer felt like marks of failure. "I think," Elena said, meeting Sophie's eyes directly, "I finally understand what those quotes about courage really mean. It's not about being unafraid. It's about doing what needs to be done regardless of how you feel about it." Sophie smiled, understanding that she was being given a glimpse into experiences that Elena wasn't ready to share completely. "That sounds like wisdom earned through experience," she said. "The best kind." As their conversation continued, Elena felt grateful for the journey that had brought her back to this moment of simple human connection. The woman who had hidden in corners had been replaced by someone who understood that scars could be evidence of survival rather than symbols of failure. Ghost Phoenix, the tactical legend, had evolved into Elena Rodriguez, a woman who had learned that true courage was measured not in dramatic moments of action, but in the daily choice to keep moving forward despite uncertainty and fear. The road ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities, but Elena faced them with the confidence of someone who had confronted her worst fears and emerged stronger. The scars that had once made her ashamed had become reminders of her capacity to survive and overcome circumstances that would have broken others. She was no longer hiding from the world or from herself. She was finally ready to embrace whatever came next.